We used to talk about Europe a lot more on here. This channel is, in some senses, about power, so a lot of my historical reading is still very focused on Europe, how it developed and how it outpaced the rest of the world. But in recent years, I've had very little to say about modern EU politics. About 2 years ago, I explained this in an angry little video you should watch if you haven't yet, called How the US Broke Everything and Won. The gist of it is simple. Despite what we all expected when I was a young man, Europe has utterly failed to fulfill its promise to compete with the United States. The US has won, unequivocally. Europe is still rich, still fascinating, and still a beautiful place to visit. But in geopolitical competition, the European Union is looking almost as useless as the BRICS organization. I don't talk about Europe that much anymore because Europe just isn't that important anymore, but it's still very interesting. So today I'm presenting a sort of a clip show using discussions from a recent patrons-only newscast to discuss some recent developments. Starting off with the big question, why can't the EU get it together?
I think that Europe's problems are coordination problems. I think it's sort of a testament to half measures. I think they've taken some of the steps toward unification that really far-sighted people in the mid to late 20th century realized they needed to make, but they have not been willing to take further steps. And I think it's that just sort of weirdness that has kept them in a weird kind of limbo that leads to these sort of strangenesses. Europe has tremendous resources that it is simply not using very well at this point. The limitations on the EU and the environment in which the European Union is trying to consolidate itself and brings up that maybe Europe today is a bit like the United States before Lincoln. I think that's a really, I think the analogy fails in some ways. Maybe it's more like the United States before the Constitution. There was a decade between U.S. independence and, I guess, depends on whether you go with 1776 or 1781. It's as long as a decade and a half or as short as 8 years between the independence of the United States and the establishment of the constitutional order. We had something called the Articles of Confederation, which, some people still go to bat for, say it was a better way to do it, but was seen by most elites at the time as leading to chaos and disarray. I don't think the EU today is as bad as the Articles of Confederation era, but it is true that the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln specifically in the United States in the 1860s was a tremendous step towards consolidation. And I think what's interesting, I definitely see the United States during the 19th century, really into the 20th century, even when it had a larger economy than the United Kingdom. I think it was kind of economic vassal of the British. Because even after the Civil War and the degree of unification that had been attained there, the United States didn't have just the technologies or the bureaucratic wherewithal to assert itself in international finance and international power. I'm talking about central banking, I'm talking about the Federal Reserve. But in that context, it didn't matter that much because you didn't really have fully mature systems of finance or central banking in those periods either. Like, it just wasn't that consolidated yet. The United States was far enough away with communication technologies of that era, the density of trade relations, on a variety of factors. The United States was far enough away that it could be, for financial purposes, a vassal of the British and still grow at this massive clip that made it almost an inevitability that the United States would eventually put together the financial architecture and assert itself in the ways that it needed to. Though, of course, it was really you can make an argument that the United States would have stayed in that subservient position for decades to come if it weren't for Europe shooting itself in the head with World War I and World War II. So the European Union is attempting to consolidate in a very different world. Obviously, it's a platitude that the 21st century is different from the 19th century. The 19th century and the 21st century are both time periods of incredible growth and interconnectedness and this, that, and the other thing. But the process was a lot more towards the beginning. Process is also just at the beginning in the 21st century. But international power and the sinews of international power are dramatically more formalized and established in the 21st century than they were in the 19th century. The United States was attempting to assert itself and grow rapidly in the face of a British Empire that was still exerting itself with gunboats and had all the limitations that physical power bring with it. The United States can signal its displeasure with Europe and shut down economic activity anywhere in Europe and China with a few bureaucratic moves in Washington, D.C. It's a much more locked down world in which the European Union is attempting to assert itself than the one in which the United States unified and asserted itself in the 19th century. And I think that is a key part of Europe's problem. And I think thank you for bringing that up, Primal Fuckhead. I think that is that comparison of the EU today with the United States before Lincoln is I think very, very interesting and perceptive, and gave me like a long enough rant that I might actually be able to clip out and make into a video, which I could use a few more of those. Anyway, thanks. I think Scott Logs asked for me to talk about just sort of general prospects of Europe in the aftermath of these elections. I mean, it's nice that the right wing has been blocked in France. It is very nice that the Conservative Party is finally out of power in the UK. But it remains to be seen whether any fundamental problems are going to be solved. The UK election is a interesting thing. This is another interesting artifact of the first-past-the-post system. In fact, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer actually, I think, won fewer votes than the Labour Party had won under Jeremy Corbyn in the last election. But because the Conservative Party was so widely loathed, and because the Conservatives were not willing to vote for the Conservative Party and actually split their votes between the Conservative Party and Nigel Farage's, I think, new Reform Party, we ended up seeing Labour win an extraordinary amount of power in the UK Parliament. So the right-wing vote was split. The left-wing vote was not, or centre-left vote for Labour was not split. So we saw, despite the Labour Party earning fewer votes than it had under Jeremy Corbyn, it was described as sort of like Assad-level victory. With something like 30% of the vote, they have an absurd majority in the parliament. I think there's reason to be optimistic about this in some respects. Obviously, the Conservative Party, which had somehow managed to stay in power since 2009, it was time for them. Even The Economist was like, it's time for them to go. It has a wide variety of hang-ups and dumb policies that are now out of the equation. Just sort of instant victories that I saw. There's this rather strange deporting migrants to Rwanda plan that I never learned the details of just because it sounded so absurd and obscene. That's gone now that Labour is in power. There's been a lot of going back and forth on this, but it does seem, as of yesterday, it seemed like at first we heard, the UK is no longer going to stand in the way of the ICC prosecution of Israel. And then we heard pushback. But I think yesterday it's like, no, actually they are not going to stand in the way for the stay of this. Crucially, it's not as important as what the United States does, but the United Kingdom had stood by the United States as, this is, I think, probably one of the most genocidal acts committed against Gaza. You guys recall, of course, the UNRWA controversy where Israel asserted that UNRWA had helped on October 7th, and dozens of countries dropped their support for UNRWA, the main agency that supports feeding the Palestinians. And it became clear in the coming weeks and months that Israel had almost no support for this assertion. And piece by piece, the European Union, other countries started funding UNRWA again because, it's important to feed the Palestinians. But it is nice. And it is a pleasant reaction to the UK victory that the Labour Party is slightly more sane and able to make more real changes than certainly Kamala Harris is capable of in the United States. So that's nice to see. The United Kingdom remains in pretty desperate states. The Conservative government did this to the United Kingdom through their sort of endless waves of austerity and through Brexit, an absolutely insane policy. I said it was insane at the time and likely to be incredibly damaging. And it's nice that the Conservatives are out, but the Labour Party and the United Kingdom are going to be dealing with the same crappy situation. The Labour Party has, I assume briefly, is going to have the capacity to make real change. Like, they have the power. Is Keir Starmer going to be willing to use that power to make serious changes to the United Kingdom, or is he going to remain wrapped up in sort of the austerity fascination, the complete ownership by finance in the United Kingdom that has certainly been a hallmark of the Labour Party since Tony Blair? Who knows? But I would be more hopeful about the United Kingdom than I would be about France. It's inspiring that the centrists and the leftists were able to come together to defeat the right in this election, but I just don't have a lot of hope that France is going to have much unity in government or make much progress towards any of the many problems that France may have. It's not to say that France has many more problems than Western European or U.S. Countries, but the EU as a whole, I think, has fairly serious problems still around financial unification, around working together as a whole, and France being a basket case for the next number of years will not help the European Union resolve anything. The European Union, when it unified, was a significantly larger economy than the United States. It is now altogether a significantly smaller economy than the United States. I believe this can be oversold. I think that the valuations of U.S. tech companies are certainly a bubble. I believe that a lot of the U.S. economy, beyond the valuations of discrete companies, is kind of bubblicious. I think that the primacy of finance and financial chicanery in the U.S. economy provides a lot less real value than the GDP figures might indicate. So the fact that Europe has gravitated a bit away from the ability to interact in high finance to the extent that the United States does may not be such a bad thing for Europe. So I do think that the GDP differentials between the United States and Europe are somewhat exaggerated, but it's impossible to deny that the EU, which promised to be a competitor with the United States, something that was going to even surpass the United States with its new unity and economies of scale and power, that project has failed. And the EU is still in need of not just, there's a particular crisis, so we'll do a sensible thing, which I think happened a couple times during COVID, where some of the richer countries were willing to subsidize some of the poorer countries in ways that they hadn't. There needs to be a concrete, longer-lasting solution related to European unity, and France being in disarray makes that kind of impossible to arrive at. That's sort of my broader thoughts on where the EU, as has been, is going. That said, there have been periods in the life of this channel where I have felt very in touch with what is going on in Europe and very on top of both historic and contemporary stuff. But I got to say, the past number of years, I've kind of drifted out of touch with Europe because Europe's just a lot less important. I think it was significant for me when Europe made a big stink about, we're gonna stand up against Donald Trump's renewal of Iran sanctions, and just utterly failed to do it. That kind of was pretty indicative to me about the lack of power. Angry Sweet Chili says, if Kamala wins, how will she handle a more right-wing Europe since the last EU election? I don't think it will make much difference. The U.S.'s main interest in Europe is selling more weapons. Right-wing Europe is just fine with that. I think that with some notable exceptions, almost just Orban, even right-wing folks in Europe are content to keep on doing military stuff. Giorgia Meloni in Italy being a great indicator. I just don't think that the like right-wing Europe is like is it right-wing in Europe is just U.S. politics? I guess the right-wing European right-wingers are a lot more socialist than the Democrats are. So yeah, I don't see a real obstacle for Kamala Harris because really we just don't care much about we just don't care much about Europe really anymore, other than a place to buy F-35s from us.